She was this gun-toting, whiskey-drinking broad.
The super epic fucking broad.
She was a pioneer in the industry.
She's also so famous and so controversial.
So controversial.
So she's kind of a big fucking deal.
Her story is so incredible. She belongs on this podcast because she's a broad you should know. Hello, and welcome to Broads You Should Know, the podcast about amazing and noteworthy women from history. I am your host, Sarah Gorski, and I am bringing you today a brilliant Irish broad. We have not covered very many Irish women on the podcast so far, which is kind of surprising because there are actually a shit ton of badass Irish women in history. If you recall, we have an episode about Grace O'Malley. She was the Irish pirate queen who drove Queen Elizabeth I absolutely nuts, and she changed the locks on her castle doors when her hubby was out of town. And the most impressive thing about her, for me, was that she got out of her birthing bed to fight and defeat an attacking vessel. Absolutely badass. And then, of course, we have also covered Boudica, the queen of the Celts, before the Celts were even united as the Celts. They were the Iceni tribe. And they were still the Celts were all still little tribes all across the island. And they were navigating all these land wars with the Roman Empire. And Boudica ended up uniting the tribes to fight against them and defeated not one but two Roman legions, who were the literal fiercest and most well-armed fighters on the planet at that time period. But both of those broads were OGs. They were old broads. Boudica was from 60 AD, is around the time she lived, and Grace lived in the second half of the 1500s. But today's Irish broad, is a little more recent. She is actually a figurehead in the Irish suffragette movement, whom lovingly called her Dolly Moloney. Her full name apparently was Horatia Dorothy Moloney Lancaster, or Lancaster was her married name, but her common name, and the one that you'll find her on the Googles with, is Mary Moloney. So today's broad is Mary Moloney, but the press also would refer to her as La Belle Moloney. Can you guess why? It has nothing to do with the French. You know, I'm always, trying to get a French joke in here. It has nothing to do with the French, but it has everything to do with a bell. That's right, Mary Moloney was famous for ringing a big old dinner bell at none other than Mr. Fusspot himself, Winston Churchill. Mary is famous for following Winston Churchill around with a giant bell for a whole week. And every time, this was in an election cycle, and every time he tried to speak at these election events, every time he was giving a speech, she rang her bell so loud that it completely drowned him out. And he had to try to have his meetings in secret and shit, or he had to just leave and the event got shut down entirely. And there was all this one Irish suffragette, Mary Moloney, was the spearheading. She had a lot of suffragettes around her, but she was the figurehead in this story. So here is the relevant backstory for this fun, famous story, which you may have seen circulating around, all of the feminist meme groups, which is, I think, how I saw it. So the relevant backstory for this moment, this is all happening in 1908 during the by-elections of Dundee, Scotland. I don't really know why they call them by-elections and not just elections. I did not look that up, but listeners, there's a mystery for you. So Dundee, Scotland is where this election is taking place. And Winston Churchill had previously won a seat in another area but lost it. Lots of drama. And this isn't about dudes and this isn't about Winston, so we're not going to go into the depth of it. But Winston was running for a new seat in Parliament as part of his, quote, Liberal Party in Dundee. And at this point in his career, other than losing the seat he had already won, generally speaking, Churchill was like a real rising star in his party. He was currently, at this moment, president of the Board of Trade, and 2 years after this, he would go on and become the Home Secretary. So all this being said, this by-election, which it was a fairly high-profile election. It generated a lot of press. And it also became a really big spotlight or an opportunity for suffragettes to make a lot of noise and get some attention and hopefully create some change in the legislature, right? Also, at this time, the Liberal Party in the UK was actually only promoting the liberty of men. When it came to women and women's rights, they were doing jack shit. One of the articles I researched for this episode even called out the Liberal Party for, quote, a bunch of all talk, no action bros maintaining patriarchal power while pretending to have, quote, more progressive views than conservatives, end quote. I really liked that article, personally. On top of that, Churchill himself was like a wolf in sheep's clothing at this moment. He had been with the Conservative Party, but now he was mysteriously with the Liberal Party, and eventually he would end up going back to the Conservatives. So kind of like a whole bunch of Republicans are doing right now around the US, they're pretending to be Democrats to try to win a seat. It's fucking bullshit, and it's shady as hell. And that was going on at this moment, and the suffragettes knew it. They were like, this whole situation is a crock of shit. And also, and this should, I think, shock no one, because I don't think that history completely hides this fact. But Churchill was not a big fan of feminism and the suffragettes. In fact, by most such measuring sticks, he'd probably rank as, quote, absolute misogynist. That's my quote. And it's, as it so often happens, at one of these election events during all of this pre-election cycle here, Winston runs his mouth off about female politicians. He makes a comment about women. Apparently he said, quote, I have seen with some regret some most earnest advocates of the cause allying themselves with the forces of drink and reaction. They were carried shoulder high, I am informed, by the rowdy elements which are always to be found at a public house made manifestation. End quote. This quote of his really ruffled the feathers of all of the suffragettes that were gathered in town for the election. And Mary Moloney was not having it for a second. Now, Mary, she was an Irish suffragette campaigner, and she was a member of what was the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU, they call it. And according to a segment from the archives of the London Evening News, Mary took action, and the headline of the article reads, quote, a speech spoiled, Miss Moloney's successful interruption of the Liberal candidate. And the article reads, on Monday, when Mr. Churchill was addressing a meeting of workmen during dinner time at a large factory, Miss Moloney, an Irish suffragist, appeared on the scene in a carriage and began to drown the speaker's voice with a handbell. She declared that the Liberal candidate should not address an open-air meeting in Dundee until he had apologized for some recent remarks about women politicians. For some time, Mr. Churchill struggled good-humoredly against the bell, but at last he gave up the effort in despair, saying, quote, if she thinks that this is a reasonable argument, she may use it. I don't care. I bid you good afternoon, end quote. That's not my Churchill. I have not worked on my Churchill impression for this episode. I'm sorry, but, hopefully you can hear it in his voice. And Churchill fucking hated it. He loved to talk, and he loved to hear himself talk. So having this platform removed from him so publicly was a huge bummer, and also, I'm sure, embarrassing. And he didn't handle it very well. So this kept happening. That article is from the first time it happened. Mary keeps doing this for a week. She keeps showing up at all these different events that he's speaking at. And Winston is not handling it very well at all. And at one point during one of these events, Mary is ringing her bell, and instead of, like apologizing for being an asshole who said assholery things, Winston suggests to his audience that they pick up Mary from her armpits and forcibly remove her from the event. But Mary is like quick on her feet and super snappy, and in response to this comment, Mary calmly says that she would, quote, box the ears of any man stupid enough to touch her, end quote. And nobody did. And the crowd, like, loved it. They were, like, all about it. And maybe they were also a little bit afraid of her. She also was surrounded by a cadre of other, suffragettes. So it would definitely have been, like, a scene if someone tried to pick her up and make her leave. But eventually, at that particular event, Winston's security team was able to eject her from the event somehow. But her work was pretty much done, and the crowd, that could have been seriously listening to serious Winston was not anymore. Another article during this time period read, quote, noisy tactics at Dundee. Mr. Churchill rung down by suffragettes Belle. And under the picture, the text reads, a speech spoiled. Miss Moloney's successful interruption of the Liberal candidate. At the time appointed for him to address the meeting, and when there were about 500 or 600 present, Mr. Churchill drove up in his motor car only to find that the gathering was in full possession of the ladies, who had the sympathy of a goodly majority of the crowd. Mr. Churchill re-entered the vehicle and was about to speak from it when the suffragette carriage came up, a lady inside loudly ringing a bell. The carriage drew close up to the motor, the bell clanging all the time and creating so much din. And this kept going on day after day. And at one point though, Winston arrives at the event and he discovers with great relief that neither Mary nor the Women's Freedom League were there. And he gets totally pumped up and he's prepping a speech, getting ready, and then very quietly, suddenly, they started to hear the distant clanging of Mary's bell. And soon enough, the carriage full of ladies rolls up with Mary ringing her bell out from the top of it as they came up to the crowd. And according to the newspapers, Mary yelled for all to hear, who is the strongest, an Irish woman or Mr. Winston Churchill? Love it. It's like suffragette trolling. I just love it. Trolling Churchill. And the press, I just read 3-4 articles. The press widely reported all of these happenings. And Winston was pretty deflated about it all. He did end up winning the election, sadly. I wish I could report to you that it was so effective he didn't win. No, he did actually win that election. But this week and Mary's bell went down in history. And Mary she was very active for a while. So while she was still in Scotland, she addressed a bunch of the WFL groups in Dundee and Aberdeenshire. And later in that same year, in 1908, Mary would become the organizer to the London Council of the Women's Freedom League, WFL, in 1908. And that group formed when it split. There was a split within the Women's Social and Political Union, and that was one of the splits of it. And so she kind of became the leader of that group. At a protest later that year, Mary was there and she was helping to organize it. And there was an article talking about the event that said, quote, Miss Moloney of Belle fame led a group of 4 protesters to climb the Coeur de Lion statue. She was subsequently arrested, but her fine of £5 was paid by a friend, much to her chagrin. What else do we know about Mary? Actually, not very much else came up. That is kind of like the bulk of her story. One of the other facts I pulled up about her was that she was born in Sandy Cove, County Dublin, on September 29th, 1878, or possibly I think it was 86 and 84. There were a couple different potential years listed in the sources, but 1878 was the year supposedly most likely to be the year she was born. And later on, her family would move to Bray County, Wicklow. And then a couple years after the whole Winston and all the suffragette organization, in 1911, she marries a man named Egbert Lancaster. So that's how she gets her Lancaster name. And they proceed to have children. And she still, I think, remained very active during that time period. But shortly after giving birth to a son in her home in Richmond, London, in 1921, Mary dies. It did not say that she died of childbirth specifically. It didn't say what she died of. But her obituary appeared in the Vote newspaper. And they said, quote, "All the old members of the Women's Freedom League were deeply grieved to hear of her death after a short illness of our old comrade, Dolly Moloney, the bright and bonny and resourceful little Irish girl who rang the bell at Mr. Churchill's historic Dundee election, when the women decided he should not be allowed to speak." And that, my friends, is Mary Moloney, or Dolly Moloney, as her friends called her. She had a few different names. Her Irish sisters finally received the vote in 1928. So she missed it by 7 years. She was already gone. But she fought hard for it, and she fought hard against Winston Churchill. The chutzpah, right? The Irish broads have a lot of balls, and I love that about them. And Mary Moloney is no different. To learn more about Mary Moloney, see pictures of her and her Belle and quotes from this episode, head on over to broadsyoushouldknow.com. While you're there, click on over to the About page and read more about me. My bio, photo, links to my stuff, all right there. Are you following Broads You Should Know on social yet? We are on Facebook and Instagram and YouTube. Subscribe on YouTube at Broads You Should Know. We are also on Twitter. I still call it Twitter at BYSK Podcast. If you're a fan of this podcast, then help spread the word about us. Leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, or comment and like on social, or share an episode with friends and family. That is the best way to help new people find us. Broads You Should Know is produced by me, Sarah Gorski, and edited by Chloe Skye, with original music by Darren Callahan. Finally, if you really enjoyed hearing about Mary Moloney, I highly recommend you check out a few of our previous Broads episodes, especially our other Irish badasses, Grace O'Malley and Boudica. See you next week for another Broad You Should Know.